Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about the French Revolution and the question of what caused it, in the sense, whether it was a political revolution or whether it had a more economic root. So, Dr. Simon Peaple is coming back to us today, and so I'll see you there. Well, welcome back to the programme.
Hi, thank you for having me back.
So, in the French Revolution short introduction that William Doyle wrote, at one point he talks of the revolution coming about as, and I quote, the absolute monarchy finally succumbing to institutional and cultural paralysis, and thus having to call the Estates General. What would be your thoughts on this idea?
Well, I think if you take someone of Doyle's eminence who's written so much on it, you're not going to disagree that there is an element of that. I mean, the first point to take is this idea of institutional paralysis, rather than the idea that somehow there was a popular revolution which overthrew the French monarchy, which is kind of how the French Revolution comes down in history to non-historians. Is, there was sort of crowds on the Bastille, and somehow or other this revolution took place, and actually most of that is quite fanciful. So I think it's right, first of all, to say we must look at how far the Ancien Regime collapsed, rather than that somebody overthrew it. Certainly in 1789. The main issue, I think you'd first of all say, is that the Marxists saw this as an entirely economic process. And most people since have begun to challenge that view, and to say, well, no, actually, in the 19th century, it was easy to look back and see it as some kind of economic revolution because of who came to power or who began to emerge. But actually, the revolution itself starts from a point where one way of running France runs out of steam. So if you look at the process of the French monarchy at the time of Henry IV and the end of the wars of religion, you've got this coming together of France, a compromise between Catholics and Protestants, which brings some kind of order to France. And in order to achieve that, the monarchy becomes more centralised than it had been before. And so Louis XIII, with Richelieu's assistance, and Louis XIV, with Mazarin's assistance in the latter years of the period of his infancy and so on, they create a centralised French government, a government which would therefore be focused on a strong central authority exerted over what had been a nobility that was largely unruly, typified by the War of the Francs, the whole way in which the French nobility sort of acted against the monarchy's interests in many ways. So when Louis XIV comes to power, we have this sort of idea of a centralisation of power. And in a sense, you could almost borrow the German term used for the Nazi period of Gleichschaltung, coordination, that things become coordinated by the French central monarchy in a way which they'd not really succeeded in doing beforehand. So you have the intendant system, you have an attempt to create a sense of the king makes decisions, you carry them out, but it was never based on a broad popular will. So whereas the British monarchy had this foundation in a parliament which was narrowly drawn, which was extremely limited in terms of any concept of democracy, but nonetheless had that idea that there was a base of consent within the country. Now, that wasn't always true, and one could make all kinds of points about the limitations of that real consent. But nonetheless, there was this idea that the king in Britain ruled in Parliament, and that therefore the king had to listen, the annual budget, the requirement for the Mutiny Act to be renewed annually, etc., etc. All of those things created a sense in which the monarchy had to govern with consent, based on consulting with the representatives within the Parliament. The French didn't do that. The French had a system whereby the king made decisions, and that's why Doyle refers to the Ancien Regime, or the absolute monarchy. I think some people are reluctant sometimes now to use the term absolute monarchy because it makes it look like it was more absolute than it was, which is one of the reasons why it collapsed. But nonetheless, we've got a situation where you've got a system of government which revolves around a central individual. And you can see during the 18th century and that the French monarchy is struggling. First of all, it doesn't have a proper tax base. There's lots of taxes, but there isn't a tax base. And one of the big fundamental problems that they have is that, unlike Britain, they don't develop this kind of Bank of England that would take government debt, would buy and sell government debt as a kind of market, and which therefore allowed the French government to achieve a degree of normality in its finances. And throughout the 18th century, the French monarchy is always in a very poor financial state. And the debates within the monarchy or the regime about what to do about that are made worse by, first of all, Louis XIV with his pursuit of la gloire, which was marvellous for him, not for the thousands and thousands of French soldiers who bled to death in the wars, and the huge taxation of the population, none of which benefits France's economy at all. It distorts it, and it makes it very, very difficult to bring about reform. And it's interesting, if you take the parallel with Britain, that the Bank of England and the reforms that go with the annual Mutiny Act and all come from a revolution where they kicked out James II, who actually was one of the most economically minded monarchs Britain had through the whole of the 17th century. His father hadn't controlled his expenditures, his brother hadn't controlled his expenditures, and yet he was actually the one who thought, no, hang on a minute, we've got a budget, we've got to do this, we've got to scale back that, do this. And it generally was what Parliament would have wanted, except of course for being Catholic. And so that challenged the regime, and therefore they booted him out. But as a result of that, William and Mary have to make concessions to Parliament that mean that power is shared. Now, in France, Louis XIV had come to the throne as a 5-year-old. Everybody's like, this won't last, or if he does, he's going to have to do this, that and the other. But his mother and Mazarin had consolidated power, and although they had to flee Paris in the time of the Fronde, nonetheless they had managed to get back into a centralised position. And so you could draw a parallel between that and, say, the Restoration of Charles II. However, the fact that they chopped his dad's head off meant that Charles II was always a bit more careful than he would have been if he hadn't had that happen. Louis XIV comes to power, agrees his own majority, asserts his authority, but creates a system which doesn't actually solve the problem of the future. It just solves the problem of the present. My monarchy is too weak, I need to strengthen it. How do I do that? Well, I centralise around me, and then I get my nobles to spend their time at Versailles, where they then are neutralised politically. Okay, so what do we do about reforming France? Well, it's a bit difficult, isn't it? Because part of the system relies on pensions. So we've always got to pay our pensions. La Gloire arguably distracts from any need to do anything at home. Okay, but hugely expensive, devastatingly expensive. One of the great ironies of French military success or not in the various wars is that the war that finally kicks the stool from under them is the War of American Independence, which they won. It was outright victory. They had supported the Americans against the British, and the British lost, and everybody's like, hooray! But actually that cost was so high that they ran out of money, and that's why you have the stop on the accounts in 1787, and why eventually they got to call the States General, because the victory is even more expensive than all the defeats that they previously made. So why have they not been able to do anything about it? Well, first of all, the system was not helping long term. All you were doing was using the year to come, or the year to come in 5 years' time's income to pay for this year. So you were running on a mortgaged basis the whole time. So your economy was being ladled with taxes, which was not going to help develop the economy, and therefore you had a problem. How could you improve your economy if you're taxing it too highly? And how do you distract French kings from their focus on la gloire when actually that's the least useful thing they can be doing? But if you focus the French nobility on the outside world, get them to go and take off commands and be involved in the military and so on, you distract them from what was happening before, which was that they were challenging the monarchy. So you centralise your monarchy by focusing everybody on the external conflicts, but you then have a problem of, well, how do you deal with that? How do you reform office holding? The paulette, the payment to hold your office. Once you've paid it, you're going to want the system to carry on. Otherwise you won't get your money back. Because the whole point of the paulette was that you had your office, you drew the income from it, including whatever inducements, bribes, whatever went with the job, which went into the initial cost. And then you went from there. And similarly, you have investments in tontines, where people are investing in some kid they think will live to be 80, and they'll be the ones who have the money at the end. All this sort of stuff going on. Very unproductive investment processes going on. So that doesn't help. So the monarchy is struggling to reform itself. And when you look at what happens with Maupeou, what happens with Maurepu, and with all the other ministers, most famously Necker at the end with his Le Comte Rendu, is that they're saying we haven't really got the money. And Necker's figures are grey, except that they don't work because actually the budget isn't balanced. And one of the really interesting things that happens during the 18th century is that the degree of debate starts to widen out. So first of all, there was an argument that the French Revolution was a philosophical one. That the philosophes, the people who published the encyclopedia and so on, were bringing new thought, new ideas, challenging the role of the church and so on, morality. The expulsion of the Jesuits being the example of where they got control of the agenda. And that therefore by 1789 people have ceased to believe in the monarchy, the church, the sort of holiness of the French monarchy, and therefore you can overthrow it because it's no longer sacred. But is that really the case? Because surely much of this never got out to most people. I mean, you can't imagine beyond a certain educated group that the works of philosophers would have been read. So you then have to say to yourself, well, what is it that the philosophers are able to achieve? Because surely they can't reach the people. But one of the things that we now know from the research that's been done in more recent years about the voices behind the French Revolution, if you like, is that the French public were informed by people who either could read or wrote newsletters, and they were informed in different ways. So you would go down to the park in Paris, and there were newsreaders, people who would stand and read the newsletter. They gathered various bits of information. There would be people who would tell you what was going on at the court. Now, of course, some of it might be rumours, some of it might be mistaken, but nonetheless there was this public on-speaking of the answers. So if you are a French person in Paris, and Paris is probably most critical at that time because in terms of when the revolution happens, the way in which you've gathered what's going on is quite interesting. So for example, if peace is declared, somebody goes round and starts telling you about the peace negotiations, what's going on. When the official declaration takes place, there's fireworks and free wine and stuff like that. But day to day, there's talk, there's been a big battle, there's been casualties, we've won, we've lost, whatever it is. And in fact, there's enough evidence to show that, occasionally the first bit of the battle might not go well, and word starts to filter through to Paris, there's been a defeat, and then you hear the victory, or indeed the other way around, that, first part of the battle went well and everybody thought that's it, and then we haven't. So you've got a French system of public opinion beginning to form underneath. So when the Compte Rendu is published, when Marlepoux is sent out into exile because of his arguments, people are actually debating, well, what is the state of the French income? Now, obviously, this isn't the lowest level of the people, but it's a good deal further down than the educated middle class philosophers. So it means there's more of a pool of people going around their daily work in Paris and its surroundings, saying, what is going on? What have we actually got any money for? Why is the money going on this? And quite interestingly, we know that this has contributed to the revolution to a degree, because we know that, for example, sometimes court scandals would be passed on to the crowds via a newsletter, which was really a leak, what today we call a leak, where the Count of X would leak the story that the Count of Y was in trouble because it suited his political ambitions. However, occasionally they forgot that if you want to leak, you have to cover it up. So, of course, the police would also be looking out for what was being said, and on occasions what was said was so obviously coming from a particular source that the police would be able to nail the source at the court, and there would be repercussions. So there are lots of things going on that says the monarchy has just failed to reform itself financially, it's failing to reform itself politically, because how does it do that? It needed somebody to take control of change. Louis XIV, for all his many failings, understood what he was trying to achieve and achieved it. Spent vast amounts on wars that were unnecessary, but nonetheless, you could say he had a goal: centralise power in France, preserve the monarchy, and he did it. Louis XV largely just carried it on, but Louis XVI was, in a way, ironically, perhaps the right person for a constitutional monarchy. He would have quietly got on being king without too much effort. if somebody had really gone to him and said, we need to do something about the monarchy, we need to do something, because there's signs during the last crisis between 1787 and 89 where he was prepared to compromise and his brothers weren't. It's ironic, of course, that he's the one who gets his head chopped off, and they come back to the French throne, although they get kicked out. But nonetheless, there is that irony that nobody was really gripping the reform and saying we've got to change, we've got to do something different, until they decided to call the Estates General. And the Marxist argument for it being a economic revolution is of course partly down to the fact that the final crisis is over funding and it's over famine. So the famine of 1787 starts to create large issues about where's grain coming from, who's hoarding grain, it creates riots, and then the cahiers that are created, which some English children will know is the name for their homework book. The French teacher will always tell them that, here's your homework book, this is your cahier. What did they do with these cahiers? They listed all their grievances, and if you look at the grievances, most people are pretty straightforward. The price of food is too high, the level of taxes is too high, so there isn't enough ways of making ends meet. Now, that makes it an economic revolution in the eyes of Marxists, but it's not really an economic revolution. But like most revolutions, the economic situation is bad enough that people are prepared to say, do you know what, I've had enough. So, if you looked at the Russian Revolution, the role of the striking women who can't feed their families is a trigger. It's not the reason there is a revolution, there's a lot of other factors, but that's definitely a factor in bringing the last bit to come. So the economics are there. And of course, if you are a Marxist and you're looking for the rise of the working class, then, it's very easy to see the sans-culottes as a kind of Marxist proletarian group. Probably rather exaggerated because, by definition, they were the skilled working class. So they lend themselves more to Lenin's view than to Marx's own. But nonetheless, they are coming to the fore. So, you can see it's economic, you can see there's an element of social class change, but that underestimates this paralysis argument that Doyle has put, which is that most systems, when they face a revolution, can try to do something about it. So if you look at Britain in 1832, the government didn't want a reform bill. They wanted to say no, but the level of public anger, the degree to which middle class views were beginning to be heard, gave one political group an opportunity to get ahead of the other by saying, let's embrace reform. Now, we all know the Great Reform Act didn't, actually solve the inequalities in Britain at all. In fact, some of them were increased by the Great Reform Act. But nonetheless, there was a sense of, hey-ho, we can't win this one, we'll give in to some degree. And of course, that's partly influenced by the French, because the British are going, well, we don't want what happened in France, so let's make sure we make a concession. The French, making their decision earlier, hadn't got the benefit of that hindsight that the British had, and struggled to make that decision. But effectively what's happening is you have a regime meeting a point of crisis. Can it do something about it for itself? Well, when they brought the estates together, Louis did accept, under pressure, but he did accept the idea of them voting in such a way that reform would actually be dominant. So, he made that key concession. He then, to a certain extent, he allowed them to meet. They did try and lock them out, but then they decided not to. So there was a lot that was tried, But unfortunately, there were a lot of people in the period of those couple of years who were going, no, we mustn't make any concessions. And it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because the parallel with Russia, they have the 1905 revolution where Nicholas tries to kind of, accept that something's got to happen. There's huge pressure from other people in the Russian court not to make concessions. And they do claw those concessions back, which is why 1917, part of the reason 1917 comes about. But the French don't really do that. They don't find a way of saying, as a monarchy, we are going to embrace this new France and we're going to change things. And they effectively suffer the fate of all those who won't make compromise, is that they're overthrown. And so in that sense, I think Doyle's point about the institutional stasis of the French Revolution is a good way to understand how the French Revolution comes about. And that first revolution of 1789 is really much more moderate than what follows. And it's so easy for people to forget that the French Revolution that Fox and others welcome is a welcome to a move towards the British model of a monarchy with a responsible assembly trying to run the country together. Albeit there's going to be a few problems, as always, when you get a new regime. Whereas, unfortunately, that doesn't get maintained. And the flight to Varennes that's it. That's made the monarchy the enemies of France. And it had to really prove it wasn't. And that is the point of no return. So there's a period when you could say there was possibly going to be a French constitutional monarchy. Could maybe have worked. Louis XVI is probably the right person to do it, but perhaps not strong enough to resist those around him who said, you can't do this, you can't give in. And in that sense, the institutional paralysis is right, but actually, as always with absolute monarchies, albeit they're not that absolute in France, you get the problem that you're reliant on the next person who picks up the baton as king, emperor, or whatever. And Louis XVI wasn't strong enough, but probably was not hostile to a kind of limited revolution. So I think institutional stasis is a very good way of summing up the French Revolution. Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to Millie and Alfie for not barking during the interview.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Peaple, and thank you for watching. Hope you found that interesting, and it was lovely having you here.